This is a brief audio review of Chapter 7, Prejudice and Discrimination against LGBTQ People. "50 years after the Stonewall Uprising, the symbolic turning point in the critical and community consciousness of LGBTQ people, things had changed. For instance, openly LGBTQ elected officials. There were states that have passed anti-discrimination laws. Hate crime legislation is expanded to protect LGBTQ people. And of course, marriage equality happened in the US and other countries. However, the majority of LGBTQ people have been the target of homophobic slurs and negative comments, have been threatened or harassed, or even experienced violence because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. So when it comes to prejudice and discrimination, they are different, right? Prejudice is when someone holds a negative view or attitude towards others without a reason or experience that justifies their negative view. But discrimination is when someone acts on their prejudice by engaging in behaviors that either do harm to or disadvantage people or groups, or when someone favors their own group at the expense of another group. So prejudice towards LGBTQ people results in discrimination, including anti-LGBTQ violence, bullying, harassment, whether it's in schools, within employment, right, where you see employment discrimination, which we'll talk about, and of course limited access to healthcare and other social goods. So when looking at violence against LGBTQ people, according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, or NCAP, 1,036 LGBTQ hate crimes were reported in 2016. In that same year, NCAP documented 77 hate violence homicides against LGBTQ and HIV-affected people. So this is an ongoing issue, and again, as we'll speak about, this doesn't really even encompass the true number, right? So as a result of this kind of issues of violence and the amount of people that are not, whose stories are not told, in 1998, Gwendolyn Ann Smith established November 20th as Trans Day of Remembrance, as a time to speak the names of those who were killed in anti-trans violence in the previous year. The statistics we have, again, are underrepresenting how many of these crimes happen, because many do not report the crimes for various reasons, right? Maybe they don't want to face retaliation or be outed publicly. No one likes being victimized. Having to re-traumatize yourself to live through that experience is a problem. Among other reasons, maybe you won't be believed. Or it could be because maybe the violence itself came from the hands of police, or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or other state operators. Or this could be coming from those in authority of other kinds, like teachers, coaches, family, or others. So when looking at bullying, teasing, and harassment, prejudice contributes to these factors of harassment, bullying, and victimization in schools, but also now this has become a much larger issue as well online. And this violence can contribute to lower self-esteem, poor academic performance, and increased truancy issues for LGBTQ youth. So this leads to seeing school as a place where harassment happens. So students will then lack a positive connection to school. And of course, that lack of connection then correlates with higher levels of depression, higher levels of suicidal thoughts or even suicidal attempts, and increased substance use and more sexual risk-taking. Some states have passed laws to protect LGBT students, but they only work if all staff have training and follow through, and also track and report incidents of harassment and bullying effectively, which is just unfortunately not the case. So moving on briefly to employment discrimination. According to Chan, that article cited earlier in the chapter, 20% of LGBTQ respondents reported experiencing employment discrimination when applying for a job or trying to get a raise or promotion. And when looking at the issue intersectionally, the results are far worse for LGBTQ people of color. So I just wanted to add a little bit of an update on the information from the book, because the book, this is how kind of fluid these situations are, that things are still changing. And this is, again, why I love sociology so much, because everything's always in flux as society changes. So let me update the info from the book slightly. In June 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also protects gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination, which was a long-sought and really unexpected victory after the Trump appointments to the Supreme Court. Until June 2020, until that decision was made final, it was legal in more than half of states to fire workers if they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. So even though marriage equality was established in 2015 across the United States, people could get a same-sex marriage and then be legally fired from work the next day. So that changed in June 2020. Okay, looking at access to healthcare. So employment discrimination is directly connected to healthcare access because in the US, we don't have universal healthcare. So many people get health insurance from their jobs. So when you lose your job, for instance, because you're gay, then you also lose your health insurance. And often that's not just for you, that's for your family or significant others. So this is an institutional discrimination, as it's baked into our current system and results in disproportionate harm for the queer community. So if we know that you're less likely to get a job because you're LGBTQ, or you're less likely to get that promotion or raise, or have as much employment stability, that's going to affect your access to healthcare and the quality of healthcare you can receive. Now, not only this, prejudice also impacts the kind of healthcare that someone accesses. So some people, because of who they are, because of their identities, are denied services from doctors or face doctors refusing to recognize their partners when they're in a same-sex relationship or caring for their queer children. Or some will face abusive language or even experience unwanted physical contact, which can be very traumatic. So in research that was done that they cite in the chapter, a large number of transgender people report being denied services or having doctors refuse to treat them, or intentionally misgendering them, using abusive language, and again, even the unwanted physical contact as well. Okay, so looking at measuring anti-LGBTQ prejudice. So in public opinion polling, basically over the last 40 years, public attitudes towards gay men and lesbians have become progressively more favorable, and attitudes towards the transgendered have obviously not been researched for as long, not for 40 years, but in recent years this has been explored in research, and the findings suggest that the majority of Americans hold positive opinions of transgendered individuals. But there are still many anti-LGBTQ values, negative stereotypes, and ego-defensive reactions that continue to exert a negative influence. So a lot of this is connected to these terms we'll talk about, obviously homophobia, which is that negative or hostile attitude towards people who identify as or who are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. And so it's a consequence of various factors like religion, fear of being homosexual, repressed envy of the freedom from tradition, or perceived threats to values, among others. Wainwright Churchill coined the term, kind of building off of the term homophobia, coined the term homoerotophobia, which is the psychological consequence of living in an erotophobic society. Basically, a society that's afraid of sex or the erotic. And in 1971, Kenneth Smith conducted the first study that attempted to measure heterosexuals' attitudes towards gay men. And Smith found that homophobic people were more status conscious, authoritarian, and sexually rigid than non-homophobic people. And that homophobic people may see homosexuals as a group that does not deserve rights. So Adrienne Rich, the amazing author, introduced the term compulsory heterosexuality. And this is the assumption that everyone's heterosexual and that heterosexuality is natural and that that's maintained and reinforced by patriarchy. And again, patriarchy is the social and political system of male dominance, which is reinforced by heterosexism. Heterosexism is an attitude and belief based on the idea that everyone's heterosexual and that heterosexuality is the only acceptable sexual orientation. So what results from this kind of confluence of compulsory heterosexuality, patriarchy, which leads to this kind of heterosexism, what results from that is heteronormativity, which is an attitude and practice which centers the world around heterosexuality, privileging that which conforms to norms, practices, and institutions of heterosexuality. So queer theory expands on the implications of heteronormativity. Combined, heterosexism and heteronormativity shape the world in which LGBTQ people live, in which all of us live. And it creates minefields of opportunities in their everyday lives to be ignored, invalidated, and sometimes punished for not living up to the standards of heterosexuality. As well, many of our traditional milestones are influenced by heterosexism and heteronormativity, like gender roles, dating, marriage, careers, parenthood. So many of these traditional milestones are really, set up in a way that only understands those roles through this very specific heteronormative lens. And this, again, all of these different milestones and roles come with corresponding heteronormative sexual scripts. So, for example, if you're talking about marriage, even though same-sex marriage, again, since 2015 is, nationwide, people will still say things like, well, who's going to wear the tux? This idea that you're still imposing these heteronormative ideas that the bride wears a white dress, that the groom wears a tux, that they're still trying to impose that ideology, that kind of heteronormative assumption of how a wedding looks or what, it's supposed to be onto couples that don't fit that heteronormative mold. So again, all these scripts are just social constructions. And LGBTQ people attempt to navigate these rules and expectations, but they also, of course, are going to encounter challenges to their well-being through this. So heterosexism and heteronormativity have labeled LGBTQ people as not having morals, as criminal, or as mentally ill. Historically, as we've covered, most social institutions denied access to LGBTQ people in employment, in housing, of course the military, and many others. So this also, again, as we've talked about, has also dictated who can marry whom. So microaggressions are another thing we need to talk about, right? Microaggressions are these common verbal, behavioral, and environmental insults, indignities, and slights that cause harm by communicating intentionally or not hostility and prejudice towards members of a marginalized group. They have negative effects on mental health, likelihood of accessing healthcare, satisfaction at work or at school. There are, again, different kinds of microaggressions, which we'll go over slightly here. So real quickly, you have micro insults, which are just rude and insensitive words or behaviors that devalue or demean someone or their group. You have micro invalidations, which take place when someone's excluded because of their group or their experience as a member of a group that's not validated. And then there's micro assaults, which is when someone makes a joke or a stereotypical generalization about a person based on their group membership. And when looking at LGBTQ minority stress, members of racial, sexual, and other minority groups who experience stressors as a result of prejudice and discrimination can have this kind of additional stress, the stress of living in a heterosexist world. So the implications of this are the psychological effects that really impact well-being, right? There's a variety of negative stressors like isolation, maybe rejection or lack of acceptance from family, being excluded or harassed by peers, not being validated in life, and again, whether this is in the classroom or in the workplace. Also, there's the issue that people are likely to internalize homophobia and heterosexism when they're living in a heterosexist society. So internalized homophobia can lead to mental health consequences, and addressing this is very important in the coming out process, as we'll talk about later. So having social support and community can help combat some of these negative effects, and especially the psychological negative effects. So also, what's interesting is this modern and aversive prejudice, and grant me a little bit of a tangent here. So as it became more taboo to be openly racist and sexist, it's not as if racism and sexism went away. The prejudice didn't disappear, it just went underground. And the more overt language was replaced with more subtle forms of racism and sexism, such as dog whistle politics. For example, they'll use terms like thug or hoodlum when they're trying to convey a racist sentiment, but it's supposedly a race-neutral word, right? Or again, grant me the tangent, Trump's slogan, right? Make America Great Again, which harkens to some mythological time in American history where everything was great. But what does that really mean when you break it down? Meaning, when was life in America better for African Americans or other people of color than right now? When was America better for women? When was America better for LGBTQ community? By using a aggressive political slogan like the MAGA one, it's a dog whistle to old white people who think fondly of the time before the 1960s. But what happened in the 1960s? The Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, Gay Liberation Movement, anti-war protest, all of these fun things. And after which, many more rights and much more access was granted to minority populations. And that's the problem for these bigoted people who really just want to go back to when LGBTQ people had to hide their identity for fear of harassment, retaliation, violence, and of course legal discrimination in many social institutions. So we're not talking about, when we talk about history here, we're talking about marriage equality was 2015, employment protections were 2020. This is not ancient history, right? But when we say make it great again, when was it great? When was it great for minority populations? Never. So it's interesting, that's a dog whistle in its own way, right? It kind of communicates a certain message to the people that are listening for that particular message. Okay, moving on. Predicting anti-LGBTQ prejudice. The violence that many people experience due to their identity highly correlates with other variables. So meaning, who is prejudiced has a lot to do with different variables like their age, their level of education, their location, so like where do you live in the country? Though of course, as the chapter discusses, hate crimes and violence happen in all 50 states. Of course, a person's religiosity is another variable that correlates with prejudice. Their political party and ideology, so that makes a significant difference. And of course, how sexually conservative someone is. So in research cited in the chapter, people who score higher on right-wing authoritarianism also tend to see the world in moral absolutes. They defer to authority figures, and they like to discipline people that transgress their supposed norms of what they think is right and wrong. And so, of course, those people have a very negative view of LGBTQ people. And another interesting correlation, again, is gender role beliefs. This predicts attitudes towards LGBTQ people, meaning people who support very rigid, old-timey gender roles, this idea that women act this way, men act that way, and really support a gender binary, also do not support LGBTQ people. But people who dismiss gender role beliefs and have, more progressive gender role expectations are more supportive. Similarly, research has found that more negative attitudes towards transgender people are associated with authoritarianism, political conservatism, sorry, that one's always a tongue twister for me, rigid views about gender, and lack of contact with transgender people. These all had more negative, people that had these kind of, whether they were authoritarian or conservative, politically, or these kind of things, had no contact. This meant that they had more negative views than people who did have, less authoritarian, less conservative, less rigid views of gender, and more contact with transgender people have much more support of trans folks or other queer folks. So this is kind of where we come to this idea of intergroup contact, or what they call the contact hypothesis. So the contact between groups can improve group relations and reduce prejudice. But contact has to take place in specific contexts. So they go over this more in the chapter, but just very briefly. In a situation where groups have equal status, share a set of common goals, and are working cooperatively, and have the opportunity to develop emotional connections and empathy. So think about that. There's not a lot of situations in which, oppressed and oppressor are in that kind of contact, right? Where you're in a situation where you have equal status, common goals, working cooperatively, right? And developing deep emotional connections. Though there are some spaces, like for instance, let's say it could happen in a more diverse workplace. This could happen maybe even like on a sports team, or, all sorts of kind of situations where you would have to have equal status, common goals, work together, and develop emotional connections. But there's a lot of situations where people might have contact, but they don't meet those criteria, so it's not kind of a positive contact that offers this, intergroup contact in a way that will actually help reduce prejudice. So, although prejudice and threat of discrimination can obviously serve to reduce the possibility of contact between groups, heterosexuals who do have more contact with LGBTQ people have been found to have more favorable attitudes of the entire community. So it does kind of lend some support for this hypothesis that more contact could lead to better outcomes. All right, the benefits and risks of coming out. So, looking at this, obviously, the gay liberation movement of the 70s advocated for coming out. And they did so for, an important strategy of political change, but also for personal fulfillment for the individual. So the minority stress model, which we cover more in Chapter 8, connects minority identification with positive outcomes, like coping and social support, but also stressors, like rejection, having to conceal your identity, or internalized homophobia. Also, identification and community connectedness, while positive in many ways, can also lead to an increased visibility, which makes a person more susceptible to employment and other forms of discrimination, harassment, and violence. Historians in social sciences have suggested that increased visibility was critical to forming the rights movements in the past and continues to be. So contact between heterosexuals and LGBTQ people offers the possibility of allyship, or when someone works to build a supportive relationship with a marginalized or mistreated group of people that they're not a part of, right? And that the work continues even when that relationship threatens their own comfort, status, or relationships. In recent years, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and other struggles for social justice, the term accomplice has been added to this conversation. So where an ally is good, it is the first step in racial or other social justice. Moving on to become an accomplice entails putting some skin in the game, as some would call it, right? Or really moving from support to advocacy and using their privilege to challenge existing conditions, even at the cost of their own comfort and well-being. And to clarify, the accomplice, as they say, shows up and steps back, meaning being there, but also holding the space to really listen to others and center the experiences of the most marginal, while learning instead of trying to lead in a way that disregards the perspectives and interests of the people and groups they're trying to support. Many people go into allyship with the best intentions, but to make sure that the problems of exclusion that existed in previous social movements is not still an issue today, I think it's important to distinguish support from allyship from being an accomplice.